The cold of the marble seeped into his bones, a stark contrast to the scented olive oil that coated his skin, making him shiver in the dimly lit chamber. Above, the muffled sounds of laughter and passionate debate echoed the symphony of Athenian intellectual elite at a symposium. Men discussed virtue, justice, and the ideal forms of government, their words dripping with the honeyed wisdom of Socrates and Homer. Yet here, in the shadows below, their lofty ideals curdled into a different reality. A boy of 15, his youth a carefully curated commodity, lay in wait, a living ornament prepared for the appetites of the very men who shaped Western civilization. This was the brutal heart of ancient Athens, a society that celebrated democracy and philosophy with one hand, while orchestrating a system of institutionalized exploitation with the other. His master, Critias, was a man of contradictions, a respected hetaira, a pimp for the elite who moved seamlessly between the worlds of philosophy and procured pleasure. For the price of 300 drachmas, more than a typical family saw in a year, Critias had purchased not a field hand or a potter, but a boy chosen for the curve of his jaw and the light in his eyes. The house was a testament to this duality, its courtyards adorned with imported sculptures and mosaics depicting divine and carnal scenes, a physical manifestation of a culture that saw no conflict between the pursuit of knowledge and the consumption of youth. The preparation was a ritual in itself, a systematic stripping of humanity. Every morning involved baths in rose-scented water, his skin rubbed with imported Egyptian oils that cost a fortune, his diet controlled to maintain a specific physique and complexion. But the physical grooming was nothing compared to the psychological conditioning. He had been taught to anticipate desires, to read subtle gestures, to maintain a facade of willing participation while his spirit learned to dissociate, to float somewhere above the cold marble. The other boys in the household, his fellow slaves, had imparted the unspoken rules of survival. Never show genuine emotion, never form close bonds, and never, ever resist directly. These rules were the bars of an invisible cage, more confining than any physical chain. Tonight's symposium was particularly important. Critias had spared no expense, importing rare wines and exotic foods, curating his stable of boys to match the specific, whispered preferences of his powerful guests. The guest list was a who's who of Athenian influence, the brilliant and notoriously excessive Alcibiades, the historian Xenophon whose future writings would whitewash these very nights, and others whose public personas were monuments of integrity. They gathered under the guise of intellectual pursuit, yet the underground network of slaves and servants knew their true reputations, the private cruelties that flourished when the wine flowed and the torches guttered. As footsteps approached the chamber, the boy's training took over. His muscles, aching from holding the vulnerable pose Critias demanded, remained perfectly still. He arranged his expression into one of available submission, a mask designed to make the violation to come feel more meaningful to the violator. The door scraped open, and torchlight flooded the small space, illuminating Critias first, his himation draped in perfect expensive folds of purple-dyed wool. Behind him was Callicrates, a military man with weathered hands and eyes that held a familiar predatory hunger. A golden fibula securing his cloak glinted, a piece of jewelry worth a small farm, worn casually as he prepared to use a human being. "The boy has been prepared according to your specifications," Critias murmured, his tone as neutral as if he were discussing the vintage of wine. "Fresh oils from Egypt." "Positioned as you requested." Callicrates began his slow, circling inspection, his sandals clicking against the marble like a death knell. The boy's instincts screamed to run, to fight, but he remained a statue, an offering on an altar to corrupted desire. The cognitive dissonance of the moment was staggering. As Callicrates ran his fingers over the boy's oiled skin, he discussed his recent reading of Sappho's poetry, pontificating on the relationship between physical beauty and spiritual truth. The Lydians believe that true wisdom comes through the corruption of innocence. Callicrates told Critias, quoting some obscure text while positioning himself with practiced efficiency, that the soul learns its deepest lessons when the body surrenders to experiences beyond its natural inclinations. Tonight, we shall test this theory thoroughly. What followed was the logical endpoint of a culture that celebrated inequality. The physical violation was accompanied by a continuous stream of intellectual discourse. Callicrates quoted Heraclitus on change while inflicting pain, debated the nature of justice while perpetrating a profound injustice, and waxed lyrical about the beauty of youth while systematically destroying it. The boy dissociated, his mind retreating to a safe corner of his consciousness, as the philosopher's words and the soldier's actions merged into a single, traumatic instrument of his destruction. The men above debated love, while below, its most corrupted form was practiced without a hint of irony. This was the hidden curriculum of Athens, a lesson in power taught on the bodies of the young and powerless, a stark reminder that the marble pillars of democracy were mortared with the silence of countless broken spirits. The dawn after a symposium was not a relief, but a return to the machinery of the system. The boy, now just another tool cleaned and stored, moved through the servant quarters with the hollowed-out precision of his peers. No words were exchanged. Their shared trauma was a language too dangerous to speak, a reality that would solidify into an unbearable weight if acknowledged. The silence was a survival tactic, as deliberate as the conditioning that shaped their every waking moment. Meanwhile, word spread through the elite circles of Athens that Critias's symposium had been a resounding success. The boy's perceived compliance and aesthetic appeal had increased his market value, a development that filled him not with pride, but with a deep, chilling dread. He was an asset in a thriving economy, one built entirely on the currency of youth and beauty. This economy was meticulously managed. Critias's household functioned as a high-end enterprise, and the boys were its most valuable inventory. Their maintenance was a significant financial investment. The imported perfumes, the specific oils, the controlled diets of figs and white bread to maintain a pale, desirable complexion. These were not luxuries but necessary business expenses. A boy with chapped skin or a sour temperament represented a depreciation of assets. They were trained in more than just submission. They were schooled in the art of appearing educated, able to drop a line of Homer or recognize a philosophical reference, thus enhancing the fantasy for clients who saw themselves as enlightened connoisseurs, not mere abusers. This entire brutal enterprise was propped up by a sophisticated philosophical framework designed to justify the unjustifiable. The greatest minds of Athens, including Plato, had woven elaborate intellectual defenses for these relationships. In dialogues like Phaedrus and Symposium, relationships between older men, Erastes, and teenage boys, Eromenos, were framed as the highest form of love, a noble passion that supposedly transcended base physical desire to achieve spiritual and educational enlightenment. The older man was portrayed as a mentor, guiding the youth in virtue and citizenship, with the physical act rationalized as a natural part of this pedagogical bond. This intellectual cover allowed men of status to see their actions not as exploitation but as a cultural duty, a refined practice that set them apart from barbarians. It was a narrative of nobility that systematically erased the victim's experience, silencing their pain under the weight of philosophical grandeur. While the boy and others like him bore the brunt of this institutionalized abuse, they were not the only casualties in Athens's stratified sexual landscape. The lives of citizen women were defined by a different, yet equally systemic, form of control. Athenian wives, often married at the age of 12 or 15 to men decades older, lived in a state of perpetual seclusion, confined to the gynaikeum, the women's quarters of the house. They were treated as legal minors, their lives and bodies the property of their fathers and then their husbands. Their sexual experiences were solely for the purpose of producing legitimate heirs. Their pleasure was considered irrelevant, their consent never sought. A wedding was not a celebration of union but a commercial transaction, finalized with rituals like the breaking of pottery to symbolize the destruction of the bride's maidenhood. In stark contrast to the secluded wives were the hetairae, or courtesans, the most famous being Aspasia, the partner of Pericles. These women were often educated, cultured, and could participate in the intellectual life of the city, engaging in discussions with philosophers and statesmen. They appeared to possess a level of agency unimaginable to a wife or a slave boy. They could own property, choose their clients, and wield significant influence. Yet, this freedom was illusory and fragile. Ultimately, their status and security were entirely contingent on their ability to please powerful men. Their value, like that of the boys in Critias's household, was tied to their entertainment value, both intellectual and physical. They existed in a precarious space, elevated only as long as they remained desirable and amusing, a reality that exposed the narrow limits of female autonomy in a society where all paths for women were defined by their relationship to male power. Back in the slave quarters, the boy understood these hierarchies instinctively. He saw how the system was designed to isolate every category of victim, preventing the solidarity that could lead to rebellion. Wives were locked away, jealous of the hetairae. Hetairae looked down on wives for their lack of sophistication, and all of them were taught to despise the slaves, who existed at the very bottom of this human ladder. This carefully engineered social friction ensured that the anger of the exploited was never directed upward, at their masters, but sideways, at each other. For the boy, there was no escape. no alternative reality. His world was bounded by the walls of Critias's house, his future a predictable arc of use and eventual discard when his youth, his only capital, was spent. The philosophical justifications, the economic calculations, and the social structures all conspired to make his suffering not a crime, but a feature of Athenian civilization. The exploitation was not confined to the shadowy chambers of private symposia. It was sanctified by the state and woven into the very fabric of Athenian religion. Beyond the walls of Critias's house, the city engaged in public rituals that normalized and even celebrated the same abuses, granting them a divine mandate that made them unassailable. For the boy and countless others, there was no refuge, not even in the house of the gods. The systematic consumption of youth was not a hidden vice, but, at times, a public and sacred duty, a truth that made the suffering all the more inescapable. The most notorious of these state-sanctioned events were the Dionysian mysteries, festivals dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and liberation from the self. To the modern eye, these rites would appear as chaotic orgies, but they were, in fact, highly structured ceremonies that provided a controlled outlet for social transgressions. During these frenzied celebrations, participants primarily from the elite citizen class engaged in ritualized cross-dressing, group sexual activities, and acts that deliberately blurred gender lines and social conventions. The philosophical justification was that through this deliberate loss of self in physical ecstasy, one could achieve a higher spiritual enlightenment and a connection to the divine. This religious framework provided a perfect cover. A man like Callicrates could engage in behaviors during the mysteries that would be scandalous in the agora, all while believing he was performing a pious act. The rituals reinforced the existing power structure by allowing a temporary, sanctioned release of pressure, ensuring that the strict social hierarchy remained intact once the festival ended. It was another form of dissociation, this time on a societal scale. The city could project an image of order and piety, while periodically indulging in institutionalized decadence it had defined as holy. This sacralization of exploitation extended to the lives of young girls, often with the full support of their families. At the famed Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a deeply disturbing practice flourished. Young girls, some barely on the cusp of adolescence, would serve as temple prostitutes for a period before their marriage. This was not seen as a defilement but as a sacred initiation, a form of religious devotion to the goddess. Parents actively paid for the privilege of having their daughters participate, viewing this state-sanctioned loss of innocence as a crucial step toward womanhood and future fertility. The psychological trauma of a child being used in this way was completely disregarded, buried under the weight of ritual and tradition. Her body was not her own. It was an instrument for divine favor, just as the boy's body in Athens was an instrument for philosophical and physical gratification. The framework was different, religious instead of intellectual, but the brutal outcome for the child was the same. Even the most fundamental institution of society, marriage, was built upon a foundation of what would now be recognized as state-sanctioned abuse. An Athenian wedding was rarely an affair of the heart. It was a cold economic and political transaction between 2 men, the father of the bride and the groom. The bride herself, typically a girl of 12 to 15 years old, was the commodity being transferred. Her consent was not just overlooked, it was considered irrelevant. She was moved from being the property of her father to the property of her husband, a man who could be 30 years her senior, a stranger chosen for his wealth or connections. The wedding ceremony itself was rife with symbolism that underscored this violent transition. The ritual of the Akatelutha Gamaliel, where the bride was led from her childhood home to her husband's house, often involved gestures mimicking capture. The breaking of pottery symbolized the breaking of her maidenhood. Every element of the ceremony emphasized her role as a vessel for producing legitimate male heirs. Her personal terror and confusion, silenced by the celebratory feasting and the societal imperative to continue the family line. For the boy in Critias's household, understanding this broader context was another lesson in hopelessness. It meant that the system that held him captive was not an aberration, it was the system. It was present in the wild torchlight of the Dionysian frenzy, in the hushed sanctity of the temple, and in the celebratory wedding processions that wound through the city streets. The men who used him on Saturday night might well be the same men who, on Sunday, would piously lead a public sacrifice to Dionysus, or proudly give away their 12-year-old daughter in a lavish wedding. There was no cognitive dissonance for them because the culture had been meticulously engineered to avoid it. The abuse of the powerless, whether a slave boy, a temple prostitute, or a child bride, was not a moral failing. but a celebrated feature of a civilization that drew no line between the sacred and the profane when it served the interests of the powerful. The gods themselves, it seemed, were complicit in the silence. The passage of time in Critias's household was not measured in years, but in the cyclical erosion of the self. The boy, now on the cusp of manhood, had become a veteran of the shadows, his spirit so deeply buried that its stirrings were faint and infrequent. He watched with a detached, clinical eye as new boys arrived, their faces still holding the light of a world beyond the marble walls. He saw their confusion, their terror, and their eventual breaking, a process as predictable as the seasons. He was now one of the older boys, and the household's unspoken hierarchy demanded he play a role in this cycle. Sometimes, he was tasked with teaching a newcomer the poses, the oils, the art of dissociation. In those moments, he saw a flicker of his own former self in their eyes, a reflection that was both painful and alien. Some of the boys, unable to construct a protective shell, simply crumbled. They stopped eating, their eyes growing vacant, their bodies becoming hollow vessels that no longer responded to commands, a living death that was often a prelude to a physical one. Others, more ruthlessly adaptive, learned to exploit the newer, more vulnerable arrivals, becoming junior predators in a system that rewarded cruelty. They were the lucky ones, in a twisted sense, for they had at least secured a form of power, however vile. The boy navigated a middle path, maintaining the beautiful, compliant hollowness that kept him valuable, yet feeling the immense, exhausting weight of the performance more with each passing day. This personal corrosion was a microcosm of a broader societal decay. Athens, for all its dazzling achievements in art, philosophy, and governance, was built upon a foundation of profound moral rot. The very men who drafted laws and debated ethics in the assembly were the same men who demanded the most debasing services from Critias's household. The city's celebrated democracy, a beacon for the ages, was a privilege reserved for the few, funded by the systematic dehumanization of the many. The relentless pursuit of beauty and wisdom had become entangled with a culture of entitlement and predation, suggesting that the glory of the polis was inextricably linked to its capacity for cruelty. The philosophical justifications that had once sounded so sophisticated now rang hollow, even to some Athenians. Revealing themselves as little more than elaborate lies, the powerful told themselves to sleep at night. The civilization that gave the world Socrates was the same one that consumed its youth with a quiet, relentless efficiency. The boy's own value was beginning to depreciate. Critias's gaze lingered on him less often, already scanning for the next fresh face, the next unbroken spirit. The dread of his initial days was now replaced by a different fear, the fear of obsolescence. To be discarded from this beautiful hell was to face an even worse fate, sail to a mine, a farm, or a common brothel where the pretenses of civility were stripped away, and the brutality was raw and direct. His survival had always depended on his desirability, and now that currency was fading, he found himself trying, in fleeting moments, to remember the boy he had been before the slave market. He would grasp for the memory of his mother's face, the sensation of mountain stream water on his skin, the sound of his own name, now long forgotten. But these memories were like smoke, dissolving the harder he tried to hold them. Innocence, once lost, proved impossible to reclaim. Its memory was the final casualty. One evening, as the familiar sounds of a new symposium echoed from above, the preparations felt different. It was not the sharp terror of the unknown, but the heavy resignation of the inevitable. The oil was applied, the pose was struck, but his mind was a numb void. When the door opened, it was not Callicrates, or any of the regulars, but a stranger, younger, with the eager, arrogant eyes of a new patron being initiated into the rituals of the elite. As the young man approached, quoting a line from Aeschylus about fate, the boy performed his part perfectly. He was the compliant, beautiful object, a living lesson in Athenian power. But inside, the last ember of the child who had once played in those mountain streams finally guttered and went out. He had survived, but at the cost of his soul. The story of ancient Greece is a dual inheritance. We rightly marvel at the Parthenon, study the dialogues of Plato, and trace the roots of our democracy to its shores. But we must also listen for the other. Fainter echoes in history, the echoes of trauma, of silenced screams from cold marble chambers, of the countless lives consumed, so that a privileged few could debate the meaning of beauty and justice. To understand Athens fully is to acknowledge this devastating contradiction, that the light of Western civilization cast a very long and very dark shadow. The marble columns still stand, the philosophical texts still inspire, but the human cost is etched into their foundations, a permanent reminder of the price of a glory built on suffering. Thank you for watching. If this journey into the hidden truths of history resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more content that challenges what we think we know about the past. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please comment below and let us know where you're watching from. It's incredible to connect with you across time and space, united by a shared curiosity for the stories that shaped our world.